This is the long-term review of Sony Xperia 10 Mark IV, and there's a joy in using a Sony mid-range phone. Hi everyone, this is JD, your gadget review friend. Welcome, and welcome back to GadgetRevNow. This is the long-term review of Xperia 10 Mark IV, and right now the Mark V is out, but the question here is it worth the upgrade or the Mark IV is a better value? There are certainly good features of this phone that stands out in the sea of mid-range phones that certainly make this phone a good buy in 2023. So after a year of existence, is this phone still worth it? Let's go to work. Let's talk about the design and the form factor of Xperia 10 Mark IV. If there's a couple of words that I could describe this phone, it's stand tall in the sea of mid-range phones. And this simply puts this phone in the category of one of the tallest and most slender phone. Of course, this form factor is very prominent with Xperia phones, and this is similar to the older Xperia phones. Aside from the tall 20:9 aspect ratio, Sony has given this phone a front-firing speaker, the top grille is acting as an earpiece, and the lower grille has the loudspeaker. I'm really loving the design choice because it also affects how you hear the sound when you're watching videos. It makes the sound louder than a smartphone with bottom-firing speakers. At the back, you wouldn't see the size optic logo, and I guess this is reserved to the more expensive Xperia 1 and Xperia 1 Pro. The only downside of the design is the plastic construction. You'll be needing a case for this phone if you want to keep the phone good looking, because anything that scratches the phone will give permanent damage to the body. The screen is protected by Gorilla Glass Victus that provides excellent screen protection, so I will just use a case and no screen protector for this phone. If you're planning to upgrade to the newest Sony Xperia 10 Mark V because you think that will be faster than the older model, just skip the newest mid-range phone from Sony. Both Mark IV and Mark V are powered by Snapdragon 695 with the Adreno 619 GPU. This ends the debate of upgrading to the latest version because technically it will provide you with the same performance. Heavy games will be okay. I played Mobile Legends on this phone without any hiccups, but the graphics performance is not as good as you can see on a flagship phone. But on heavy gameplays, it rarely stutters. For anyone using this phone on casual use, and I believe that's the main reason of buying a mid-range phone, Xperia 10 Mark IV will work in a fly. Again, using this phone for the last 6 to 8 months on my day-to-day activity, watching videos, texting, calling, and using this for vlogging, it feels like any other phone. Although it only has 60Hz refresh rate on the screen, the overall feel is pretty snappy. And based from my review and testing a lot of Chinese phones with MediaTek processors to Samsung phones with Exynos chipset, I would take Snapdragon 695 any time of the day. The camera of this phone is pretty solid for what it's worth. It has 12 megapixel main, 8 megapixel telephoto, and 8 megapixel ultra wide. And if you're wondering what's the difference between Mark IV and Mark V, it's just the resolution and the sensor size of the main sensor, bumping it to 48 megapixel with half-inch sensor. Inspecting the images coming from this phone, it looks similar to the one you would see on a proper camera. It crashes the shadows and less of a high dynamic range look. It doesn't have the usual camera features of the flagship Xperia phones that can shoot raw video with log profile or even the Pro mode with a very good and robust layout. It does, however, provide you with the manual mode similar to a Pro mode that you can dial in the shutter speed, aperture, white balance, and so on. You also have the creative features, night mode, portrait selfie, panorama, and slow motion for ease of use. I guess the dead giveaway that puts this phone on the mid-range class is the lack of 4K video recording and just a so-so performance on the 8 megapixel selfie camera. Hi everyone, this is Sony Xperia 10 Mark IV using the rear camera, the main sensor, 1080p at 30 FPS. Now let's switch to the ultra wide. Let's see how wide it is. So I just checked the footage on 1080p 30 FPS using the main sensor. The autofocus is hunting and the video quality is just okay. So this phone is not for vloggers, but for casual users, this phone is good enough. The hero of this review is the preservation of the legacy feature called headphone jack. If jack was killed on the Titanic, Sony was able to save it at least on the headphone jack on the Xperia 10 Mark IV, and I apologize, that's a dad joke. There's a couple of features for this headphone, one being used as support for high-fidelity headphones or earbuds if you still have a 3.5mm hi-fi headphone. And the other function is the usage of the external microphone for vlogging. Because this also serves as an audio jack, you can use great quality lapel mic like the Sensinizer XV Lav, and you can definitely vlog on full HD with great audio input. So competing with mid-range phones with 4K recording, it's a toss between higher resolution video versus great sounding full HD video. Overall, I'm happy that Sony didn't kill the headphone jack and continue to serve this on Xperia 10 series. And talking about relevance, this phone is in the middle of Chinese phones, which never updates or sometimes will, and phones from Apple, Samsung, and Pixel that will give you at least 5 years of security patches. Sony Xperia 10 Mark IV is in the middle with 3 years of software support, and this will end June of 2025. Sony is promising to provide updates every 90 days or 3 months, and currently this phone is running on Android 13. So in terms of relevance, this phone will still update for 2 more years before Sony abandons the ship. And aside from the headphone jack, there's a lot of extras on this phone. One would be the legacy notification LED, which Sony calls it as notification dot on the upper right corner of the screen. This blinks if you have notification, or red solid dot if the phone is charging, and goes to green solid light when it's fully charged. It also has this reliable side-mounted fingerprint sensor that works really well if you're a lefty, because you're kind of grabbing it naturally with your index finger, and of course, the right thumb will also be a good candidate. On my everyday use, this rarely miss unlocking the phone, it will just miss if your registered finger is a little sweaty. And the last great extra feature of this phone is the easy-to-pull SIM tray. You don't really need SIM ejector tool, as you can use your nail to pull out your memory card or your SIM card. And speaking of storage using the micro SD card, this phone has 128 gigs of base storage that can be expandable up to 1 terabyte. And with expandable storage, you will never run out of space, as you can swap SD card when it's full. So will you buy it or hate it? I will hate this phone if I'm looking for a mid-range phone that has a camera feature that automates everything from the colors, white balance, and beautification. You are better off Samsung or Pixel, those phones that will give you HD or looking shots. This phone looks similar to what iPhone SE will produce, a more subtle and natural looking image quality. I would also hate this phone if I want to keep the phone minimal without a case, because this would look ugly over time because of the plastic construction. And if you're coming off a mid-range phone with fast charging capability, this is lower than the competition. And I will buy this phone if you have smaller hands and you want to use this phone on a single hand. Because of the taller and slimmer aspect ratio, you can definitely type on the keyboard in one hand. Also, Snapdragon 695 will give you 5G connectivity and one of the most decent mid-range processor today. Even though the phone only has 6 gigs of RAM, on a normal day-to-day activity, without too much gaming, this phone is very usable. And of course, if you need a phone that will last you 2 to 3 days on a casual use, I don't think anything can beat this phone aside from those phones that offers bigger battery but normally sucks on performance. This phone will give you a very good experience overall, and I can say that there's a joy in using a Sony mid-range phone. And there you go, hope you enjoyed this video. I'll continue to compare this phone in our channel, so stay tuned. And as always, thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.
Nederlands band zet deze track in je playlist.